Long before the Taj Mahal, before the Mughals, before the stories most people remember, ancient India was ruled by empires whose power stretched across rivers, forests, deserts, mountains, and seas. Some carved their words into stone. Some sent ships across the ocean. Some vanished so completely that only broken coins, ruined temples, and silent inscriptions remain. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, tonight we uncover ancient India's forgotten empires and the hidden power they left behind. At the edge of the monsoon, where the sky lowers over the plains and the first hot winds begin to smell of rain, ancient power in India is never only a matter of kings. It begins in mud, silt, timber, iron, elephants, flooded fields, and roads that are not yet roads, only beaten paths beside rivers. A ruler may sit beneath a canopy and speak as if the world bends to command. But the land is older than any throne, and in India the land often decides first. It decides through the Ganges, through the Indus and its vanished urban echoes, through the Narmada cutting westward, through the Krishna and Godavari crossing the Deccan, through forests that feed armies, through mountain passes that admit merchants and invaders, through coasts where ships return with horses, gold, spices, glass, and rumours from places most people never see. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of ancient India's forgotten empires is not simply the story of one famous ruler, one golden age, or one lost capital. It is the story of a subcontinent so varied that power rarely stays still for long. It rises in one river basin, hardens into taxation and armies, cracks under distance and local ambition, then reappears somewhere else wearing a different language, sacred symbol, coin, and temple. Some empires vanished from memory because they were absorbed so deeply into what came after them that their outlines became difficult to see. Imagine standing on a high ridge after the rains, looking east across the Gangetic plain. The air is wet, the fields glisten, and every river branch suggests movement boats, cattle, grain, messengers, monks, tax collectors, soldiers. Iron tools bite into soil that earlier communities could not farm so easily. Rice fields spread where forests once stood. Villages multiply. Small chiefs become larger chiefs. Larger chiefs begin to imagine tribute from people they will never meet. No inscription announces the exact moment when landscape becomes empire, because there is no single moment. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how quickly these transformations occurred in different regions. But what survives in the record suggests a slow tightening of connections, more food, more people, more metal, more trade, more conflict, and finally more ambitious forms of rule. This is one of the hidden powers of ancient India scale. The subcontinent is not a single stage with one spotlight. It is a series of ecological worlds pressed together. The northwest opens towards Central Asia and Iran, a corridor of horses, migrants, raiders, and ideas. The Gangetic plain becomes a machine of agrarian wealth, where surplus grain can feed cities, courts, and armies. The Deccan Plateau, often treated as a space between north and south, is in fact a powerful world of its own. Rich in roots, minerals, and political experiments, the far south looks both inward to fertile river valleys and outward to the ocean, where merchant networks can make a port as important as a battlefield. Monsoon winds are not obstacles, they are engines, and sailors learn their rhythm. To understand these forgotten empires, it helps to begin not with palace walls, but with the forces that make palaces possible. Water is one. The monsoon can bless a kingdom or expose it. A good season fills tanks, wells, canals, and fields. A failed season strains the obligations between ruler and ruled. Ancient states present themselves as protectors of order, but their authority is always tested by harvests. Inscriptions praise kings who dig reservoirs, repair embankments, and grant land near irrigation works. Because control over water is never only practical, it is political. Yet no ruler fully controls the monsoon, and no single explanation fully accounts for why some states endure longer than others. Climate, war, inheritance, trade, religion, local elites, and geography all press on the same fragile structure. Then there is movement. India's empires are often imagined as land powers, and many are, but their hidden strength lies in networks. A forest route that brings elephants to a royal army may matter as much as a walled city. A caravan path carrying textiles may bind distant regions more firmly than conquest. A monastery near a trade road may become a bank, a school, a resting place, and a keeper of memory. A port on the western coast may connect inland cotton fields to Roman demand. The surprising detail is that some of the most durable parts of empire are not armies at all. They are accountants, scribes, merchants, monks, boat builders, and donors whose names appear briefly on stone and then disappear back into the crowd. This makes the forgotten empires difficult to see in a simple line. The Mauryas are remembered because Ashoka's inscriptions speak across centuries. The Guptas are remembered because later tradition and modern history both found brilliance in their courts. The Cholas are remembered because their temples still rise with astonishing force from the Tamil landscape. But between and around them stand other powers, the Nandas, Satavahanas, Indo-Greeks, Shekas, Kushans, Pallavas, Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, Palas, and many more regional formations whose influence was not small, simply because modern memory is uneven. Their records are scattered across inscriptions, coins, ruins, foreign notices, religious texts, and later traditions that must be handled carefully because memory reshapes the past. The mystery, then, is not whether ancient India had empires. It did, repeatedly, and often with extraordinary sophistication. The deeper mystery is why so many of them feel half-hidden, their power visible only when the light strikes the evidence from the right angle. A broken coin in Afghanistan, a Brahmi inscription in a cave, a Roman amphora fragment near the coast, a copper plate land grant preserved by chance, a Chinese pilgrim's report, a sculpted railing around a stupa. Each is a small door. None opens the whole past. Together they reveal a world where authority flows like water through channels both official and invisible. By the time the first great imperial centres begin to rise in the east, the pattern is already waiting. Rivers carry grain and people. Forests hide resources and resistance. Roads lengthen. Cities swell. Power is gathering, but it is not yet fixed. Somewhere in the middle, Ganges Plain, a kingdom is watching the roots, the metals, the elephants, and the rival courts around it. Its name is Magadha, and its rise will show how quickly a regional power can become something far more dangerous when geography, ambition, and historical timing meet. Long before later, kings learn to speak in the language of conquest. Something quieter happens across the subcontinent, the great cities of the Indus world, once planned with baked brick streets, drains, wells, granaries, craft quarters, and carefully measured urban order, no longer dominate the northwest as they once did. Their decline is not a single night of ruin, not one burning gate, not one invader's footstep that explains everything. It is slower and more difficult to hold in the mind. Rivers shift, trade patterns weaken, urban centres thin out, populations move, some sites shrink while others continue in altered form. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the balance of climate stress, river change, economic disruption, and internal transformation. But the old urban world does not simply vanish into emptiness. Its people, skills, crops, animals, habits, and memories scatter into new landscapes, and in that scattering, the foundations of later India begin to form. What follows is not a dark age in the simple sense. It is more like a long rearrangement. The dense urban order of places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro gives way to smaller settlements, rural communities, regional cultures, and shifting forms of social life. In the northwest, late Harappan traditions survive in pottery, settlement patterns, and everyday practices, even when the old cities no longer command the same authority. Farther east, the Ganges plain begins to grow in importance. Though it does not become imperial overnight, forests still cover huge stretches of land, rivers flood and change course, communities experiment with crops, cattle keeping, craft production, and seasonal movement. In many places, history leaves no royal names at all, only fragments, a storage pit, a burial, a painted vessel, a copper object, a hearth with ash, a seed preserved by accident. This is one of the most important and least theatrical transitions in ancient history. Empire needs surplus, but surplus first needs fields. Fields need tools, labour, water, and some stable claim over land. In the centuries after the Indus cities fade, farming expands in varied ways across northern India, with wheat and barley still important in some zones, rice becoming increasingly central in others, and pastoral life continuing alongside settled agriculture. The Middle Ganges plain is not easy country at first. It is wet, wooded, and thick with ecological challenges. Clearing land here requires effort over generations. The later image of the Ganges as the heartland of kingdoms hides the long labour that made it so. Before officials can collect tax from rice fields, someone has to cut the forest, manage water, build villages, and survive disease, floods, and animals that do not recognize human ambition. Iron changes this world, though not as a magical invention that instantly creates empire. It appears unevenly, region by region, and its early use remains a subject of debate. What matters is not only the presence of iron, but its growing availability and the ways communities learn to use it. Axes, ploughshares, knives, arrowheads, and tools for craft and agriculture gradually widen what people can do. Forest clearance becomes more effective. Agriculture deepens. Warfare changes. A ruler with access to iron resources and smiths gains possibilities that earlier chiefs did not possess in the same way. Yet technology alone never explains history. Iron does not command loyalty. It does not organize labour by itself. It does not turn a clan into a kingdom unless social and political conditions allow it. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation, because tools, rituals, kinship, trade, and violence all move together. At the same time, another kind of power is forming in sound rather than stone. The early Indo-Aryan ritual world, preserved through oral tradition, brings with it hymns, ceremonies, social categories, and ideas about order, sacrifice, kingship, and cosmic balance. These traditions are not written down in their earliest form, and this creates one of the central challenges of ancient Indian history. The texts remember worlds that changed as they were transmitted, and the archaeological record does not always match neatly with literary memory. Scholars still debate how to align these sources, and the safest path is to treat them as different kinds of evidence, each powerful, each limited. What survives in the record suggests societies where cattle, lineage, ritual prestige, warriors, priests, and chiefs all matter before large territorial states become common. The surprising thing is how much of later imperial India begins here, before empire has a name. The idea that a ruler must be more than a successful fighter begins to harden. He must give, protect, perform rituals, reward supporters, control land, and stand at the centre of a moral order larger than himself. Power becomes wrapped in sacred obligation. The king is not yet the bureaucratic monarch of a vast state, but the imagination of kingship is expanding. Ritual specialists help define authority. Assemblies, clans, and local elites still matter. Some communities remain outside the direct control of emerging kingdoms, and later texts often describe forest peoples, frontier groups, and rival cultures through the lens of those who wish to control or classify them. The picture is never neutral. Across the subcontinent, regional diversity deepens. In the Gangetic north, painted pottery traditions such as painted grey ware and later northern black polished ware are often associated with changing settlement patterns, social ranking, and expanding exchange, though the meanings of these materials remain debated. In central and southern India, other worlds develop on their own rhythms, including megalithic burial traditions marked by stone circles, dolmens, iron objects, ceramics, and grave goods that suggest complex societies not easily reduced to northern models. These communities are sometimes treated as background to the better-known empires, but they are not background to themselves. They are building local hierarchies, trade links, ritual landscapes, and memory systems that will later feed into powerful southern kingdoms. Trade also begins to thicken the map, not yet the grand oceanic commerce of later centuries, not yet the crowded imperial roads of the Mauryas, but enough movement to matter: salt, metals, beads, cloth, cattle, grain, ornaments, and ideas travel between regions. Craft specialization grows where demand and settlement density allow it. Villages become towns, towns become nodes. Some are fortified, some sit beside river crossings, some grow near resources. Some become sacred places before they become political ones. The hidden power of these early centuries is accumulation. Nothing looks inevitable while it is happening, but each cleared field, each iron tool, each ritual claim, each exchange route, each local chiefdom adds weight to the future. By the time the political map begins to sharpen into larger kingdoms, the subcontinent has already passed through a profound transformation. The old Indus cities have faded, but urban life has not been forgotten forever. The forests of the Ganges are giving way unevenly to fields and settlements. Ritual authority is becoming more elaborate. Iron is widening the reach of human labour and war. Local powers are learning to think beyond immediate kin and village. Out of this long, restless preparation come the Mahajanapadas, the great realms and republics of early historic India. Among them, One eastern kingdom waits with unusual advantages land rich enough to feed armies, forests that can supply elephants, and routes that lead toward every rival it will one day challenge. In the eastern Gangetic world, where rivers spread into fertile plains and forests still press close to human settlement, Magadha begins as one kingdom among others, not yet the obvious centre of an empire. To the west lie older regions with prestigious lineages and ritual memory. To the north are republic-like clans and rival powers whose political habits do not always fit later royal models. Along the river route stand cities and market centres where wealth is becoming easier to gather and harder to ignore. Nothing about this landscape announces that Magadha must dominate, yet its position is quietly dangerous. It sits near rich alluvial soil, near forests that can supply timber and elephants, near mineral zones that later tradition associates with iron, and near waterways that make movement faster than overland marches through thick country. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that Magadha's rise is not an accident of one brilliant king. It is the result of geography becoming strategy. The early rulers of Magadha do not leave behind a simple, clean archive. Their stories come through Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical traditions, through later texts shaped by memory, teaching, rivalry, and political imagination. Names such as Bimbisara and Ajatashatru appear with force, but the details around them are layered with moral storytelling and religious meaning. Scholars still debate how much can be reconstructed with certainty. Yet behind the stories stands a convincing historical pattern. Magadha expands while other states struggle to match its combination of resources, location, and political aggression. It absorbs, pressures, marries into, or fights neighbouring powers. It learns how to use the new world of cities and surplus more effectively than many rivals. A kingdom that can feed men, command elephants, control routes, and draw revenue from growing agriculture holds a different kind of power from a chiefdom based mainly on prestige and raiding. Its first hidden strength is food. The eastern plains, once difficult to clear and settle, become increasingly valuable as agriculture deepens. Rice cultivation, riverine movement, and expanding villages provide a base for population growth. A ruler who can tap even part of this surplus can maintain officials, fortifications, soldiers, craftsmen, and courtly display. The connection between grain and empire is not poetic, it is practical. Every march requires supplies. Every fortress requires labour. Every city requires food from beyond its walls. Magadha's advantage is that the land around it can sustain ambition, though only with human work that is mostly invisible in royal narratives. Behind every king who claims victory stand farmers bending in wet fields, woodcutters clearing growth, potters shaping storage jars, boatmen pushing against river currents, and scribes or accountants beginning to make wealth legible. Then there are elephants. In later military imagination, the war elephant becomes one of the great symbols of Indian power. But it is not only a symbol. In the age before gunpowder, elephants can terrify horses, break formations, carry commanders, and create psychological shock. They are expensive, dangerous, difficult to train, and useless without skilled handlers, which means they are also signs of organization. Magadha's access to forest zones where elephants could be captured gives it a military resource that many Western rivals envy. A lesser-known detail is that the value of elephants is not limited to battle. Their capture and management require forest knowledge, specialized labor, and state reach into regions that settled agricultural society often treats as wild. To command elephants is also to command the margins between kingdom and forest. Magadha's political geography matters just as much. Its early capital at Rajagriha, surrounded by hills, offers natural defensibility. Later, Pataliputra rises near the meeting of major rivers, including the Ganges and Sun, in a position so strategically powerful that it will become one of the great cities of ancient Asia. A city near river junctions can watch traffic, tax movement, move troops, and receive goods from several directions. In a land where roads are hard to maintain and monsoon seasons transform the ground, rivers are highways with currents, hazards, and opportunities. Whoever controls the crossings and confluences controls more than space. He controls timing. Armies can arrive faster. Grain can move farther. News can travel with boats. Power gains a circulatory system. Magadha's rivals are not weak. Kosala, Vatsa, Avanti, and the Vaji Confederacy all belong to a world of serious political competition. The Vaji, with their republican or oligarchic structures, present a particularly interesting contrast to monarchy. Later sources describe councils, assemblies, and collective decision-making among such groups, though the exact workings remain debated. To a rising monarchy like Magadha, these polities are both neighbours and obstacles. Their existence reminds us that ancient India's political possibilities were wider than kingship alone. There were clans, assemblies, republics, monarchies, and hybrid arrangements, all trying to survive in a changing landscape. Magadha's success is partly the story of one model of power outlasting or absorbing others, not because it is morally superior, but because it proves brutally effective at expansion. Ajatashatru, remembered as both ambitious and morally troubled in religious traditions, stands near the turning point. Stories connect him with conflict against the Vaji Confederacy and with new military devices, including siege engines and chariots fitted with blades. Though the historicity of these details is uncertain, what matters is the broader signal warfare is becoming more organized, more territorial, and more closely tied to fortified cities. This is not the old pattern of temporary raids for cattle or honor. It is pressure applied to land, routes, walls, and revenue. When kingdoms fight now, they fight for some machinery that produces future power. Urban life grows alongside this struggle. The period often called the Second Urbanization brings expanding towns, craft production, coinage in the form of punch-marked coins, and more complex exchange. Northern black polished ware, a fine ceramic associated with elite consumption and urban contexts, becomes one clue to this changing world, though archaeologists are careful not to treat pottery as a simple map of political control. Markets, merchants, and renunciant religious movements all flourish in this environment. Buddhism and Jainism emerge not in isolation from politics, but in a world of cities, roads, debate, wealth, violence, and dissatisfaction with older ritual orders. Magadha becomes central to these traditions as well, and this spiritual importance later helps preserve its memory. Yet the rise of Magadha is not only a grand ascent, it is also a narrowing of possibilities. Smaller polities lose independence. Forest communities face deeper intrusion. Local elites must bargain, submit, or resist. Taxation becomes more systematic. Soldiers move through land that had once known only local disputes. The kingdom gathers strength by turning many lives into resources. This is the hidden cost behind imperial formation, and no single explanation fully accounts for how people experienced it. Some may benefit from roads, markets, protection, and royal patronage. Others may feel only the weight of demand. By the time Magadha stands above its rivals, the age of scattered great realms is already giving way to something harder and more centralized. The kingdom has learned the grammar of empire before calling itself one. It knows how to use rivers, elephants, food, forts, marriage, war, and religious prestige. But its first great imperial machine will not be remembered under the name of its early kings alone. Another dynasty will seize the wealth Magadha has made possible, enlarge its army to a scale that shocks later imagination, and leave behind one of ancient India's most powerful shadows, the Nandas. The Nandas rise from the same eastern engine that Magadha has already built, but they appear in the historical record like a massive shape seen through mist. Later traditions remember them as immensely wealthy, dangerously powerful, and unpopular among older elites. Greek writers, hearing of India from soldiers and envoys after Alexander's campaigns, describe a ruler in the Gangetic heartland who commands forces so enormous that even hardened Macedonian troops hesitate at the thought of marching farther east. Indian traditions preserve memories of the Nandas as rulers of low or disputed origin, men whose power does not fit comfortably into older ideas of noble kingship. Yet their inscriptions are scarce, their royal voice does not speak clearly to us, and their empire is known mostly through those who came after them or stood outside them. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of their mystery. The Nandas may have created one of the strongest states in early India, but they left behind no Ashokan pillars to defend their memory. Their hidden machine begins with revenue. Magadha has already shown that fertile land, river control, and access to resources can transform a kingdom into a regional power. The Nandas appear to push this logic further. Later sources repeatedly associate them with vast treasure, heavy taxation, and an ability to accumulate wealth on a scale that astonishes rivals. The exact numbers given for their armies and riches are almost certainly exaggerated, as ancient writers often use enormous figures to signal awe rather than provide a census. But exaggeration does not mean invention. Behind the inflated totals is a real impression the Nanda state seems to have gathered resources more aggressively and systematically than earlier kingdoms. It may have inherited Magadha's expanding administrative habits and sharpened them into something more formidable. To collect wealth across a growing realm, a king needs more than greed. He needs officials, storage, roads or river routes, military enforcement, standardized expectations, and cooperation from local elites who may resent him but still profit from his order. Taxation in such a world is not a simple coin dropped into a royal chest. It can come as grain, labour, forest products, animals, metals, craft goods, tolls, fines, and tribute. A ruler who controls river junctions can tax movement. A ruler who controls fields can claim a share of harvests. A ruler who controls forests can draw elephants, timber, and valuable goods from the margins. A ruler who controls cities can reach merchants and artisans. The surprising detail is that the Nanda's famous treasure may tell us less about luxury than about administrative reach. Wealth piled in a capital is the visible end of invisible extraction. This kind of state changes the meaning of kingship. Earlier rulers had to prove generosity, ritual standing, military strength, and lineage. The Nandas appear in many traditions as disruptive figures, perhaps because they represent power less dependent on old aristocratic approval. Some accounts call their founder the son of a barber, or otherwise portray him as socially low, These stories may preserve hostility from elite groups offended by Nanda rule, or they may reflect genuine memories of social mobility, or they may be political slander shaped by later dynasties that needed to justify overthrow. Scholars still debate how much historical weight to give these origin tales. What matters is that the Nandas were remembered as rulers whose power felt improper to some. Their authority may have rested not on inherited prestige alone, but on money, military force, and control of the Magadhan state. Their army becomes the central image of their danger. Greek and Roman accounts, filtered through the world of Alexander, describe immense numbers of infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants in the kingdom beyond the Punjab. The figures vary, and modern historians treat them with caution. But even cautious reading suggests that the Eastern Empire was understood as a military giant. For Alexander's troops, who had already fought through Persia, Bactria, and the Punjab, the prospect of facing a huge army supported by the resources of the Ganges plain was not inviting. The refusal to march farther at the Hyphasis River cannot be reduced to fear of the Nandas alone. Exhaustion, distance from home, monsoon conditions, unfamiliar terrain, and years of campaigning all mattered. But the reports of Eastern power likely deepened the dread. A kingdom that could field many elephants and draw on vast agrarian reserves represented a different scale of war. Yet power on that scale creates its own weaknesses. Heavy extraction can make a state rich while making it hated. Large armies can defend a kingdom while draining its resources. A centralized treasury can impress outsiders while becoming a prize for ambitious men inside the system. The Nandas may have expanded Magadha's reach across much of northern India, but the stronger the machine becomes, the more dangerous its control room becomes. If loyalty depends on fear and wealth, then a successful challenger does not need to destroy every village. He needs to seize the center, redirect the army, and persuade enough officials that the old master is finished. This is where the Nandas become inseparable from the legend of their fall. Later tradition places Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, and Chandragupta Maurya in opposition to the last Nanda ruler. The stories are dramatic insult, revenge, strategy, hidden training, political cunning, and the overthrow of a mighty but unpopular dynasty. These accounts cannot be read as straightforward reportage. They were shaped by political memory and literary design. Still, their underlying structure is believable in one important sense: the Nanda state was powerful enough to be worth capturing intact. Chandragupta's later success would be difficult to explain if he had only inherited chaos. More likely, the Mauryan rise was built partly upon the administrative and military foundations the Nandas had already strengthened. This may be the strangest legacy of the dynasty. They are remembered less for what they created than for what their successors used. Their wealth becomes the fuel of another empire. Their army becomes part of another imperial imagination. Their capital becomes the stage on which another family claims destiny. Because they leave so little direct testimony, they are easy to treat as a prelude, a dark corridor before the better-lit hall of the Mauryas. But that is misleading. The corridor may have contained the machinery that made the hall possible. Without Nanda accumulation, Nanda military organization, Nanda expansion, and Nanda experiments in centralized rule, the Mauryan Empire might not have risen with such speed. A forgotten empire often disappears not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways others later absorbed. The Nandas teach this with unusual clarity. Their name survives in suspicion, awe, hostility, and rumour. They stand at the threshold between Magadha's regional ascent and India's first great subcontinental empire. Their hidden power lies in extraction, organization, and scale. They gathered the wealth of the Eastern Plains so intensely that history remembered the treasure even when it forgot the men who counted it. Then, as often happens in the long story of empires, the machine they strengthened outlived the hands that built it. A new ruler would soon take control of that machine, and under the Mauryas, Magadha's power would no longer remain a regional terror. It would speak in stone across India. When Chandragupta Maurya steps into the space left by the Nandas, he does not inherit a quiet kingdom, he inherits a weapon. Magadha already has the rivers, the treasury, the agricultural base, the elephants, the cities, and the habits of extraction that earlier rulers have sharpened. What changes now is scale and direction. Under the Mauryas, the machine no longer merely dominates the eastern plains. It begins to reach outward across northern India, toward the northwest touched by Alexander's campaigns, toward the Deccan routes, toward distant frontiers where local powers must decide whether to resist, negotiate, or become part of something larger than any kingdom India has yet seen. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the earliest Mauryan years. But what survives suggests a state with unusual ambition and a talent for turning conquest into administration. Chandragupta's rise is wrapped in later legend, and the figure of Chanakya, the strategist and political thinker associated with him, stands half in history and half in literary memory. The famous treatise known as the Arthashastra is often linked to this world of hard statecraft, with its cold attention to spies, taxation, punishment, diplomacy, fortresses, agriculture, mines, forests, trade, and the duties of a ruler who trusts no one too easily. Scholars still debate the text's dating, layers, and relationship to actual Mauryan practice, so it cannot simply be treated as a government manual sitting on Chandragupta's desk. Yet it captures something believable about the age, the sense that kingship has become technical. Power is no longer only charisma, ritual, or battlefield courage. It is information, it is surveillance, it is measured land, counted goods, watched officials, trained agents, and the constant fear that the empire may rot from within if the ruler fails to see. The Mauryan state is not a modern bureaucracy, and it should not be imagined as one. Its control varies from region to region. Some areas may be governed directly through royal officers, while others are bound through tribute, alliance, local elites, and strategic pressure. No single explanation fully accounts for how such a huge realm functioned in practice, but the broad outlines are striking. A capital at Pataliputra commands a riverine heartland of enormous value. Roads connect major centres, provincial cities, perhaps including Taxila, Ujjain, Tosali, and Suvarnagiri, help anchor the empire across distance. Officials supervise revenue, justice, trade, and public works. Forest zones, mines, and elephant reserves matter to the state. Messengers and inspectors move through the king's world like nerves through a body. The empire's power lies not only in what it conquers, but in what it can observe. Then comes Ashoka, and with him the Mauryan story changes from imperial expansion to something stranger, an empire speaking about morality in stone. Before Ashoka becomes the ruler remembered for Dhamma, he appears to have inherited the hard frame of Mauryan rule. His empire is already vast, built by predecessors who understand war and administration. But Ashoka's own turning point is linked to Kalinga, a region on the eastern coast that resists Mauryan control. The conquest is remembered as devastating. In his inscriptions, Ashoka presents the suffering caused by the war as a source of remorse, describing deportations, deaths, and the grief of families. The exact historical circumstances of the Kalinga campaign remain debated, and the inscription is also a royal message carefully crafted for public effect. Still, it is extraordinary. Ancient conquerors often boast of destruction. Ashoka does something rarer. He lets the wound remain visible. This does not mean Ashoka becomes a powerless saint, as popular imagination sometimes suggests. The empire does not dissolve into gentle idealism. Officials still exist. Punishment still exists. Borders still matter. Royal authority remains very real. Ashoka's Dhamma is not simply Buddhism as a private faith, nor is it a modern program of tolerance in the simple sense. It is a moral and political language meant to shape conduct across a vast and diverse empire. It emphasizes restraint, respect for parents and elders, kindness to servants, generosity to religious communities, concern for animals, moderation in ceremonies, and respect among sects. What survives in the record suggests a ruler trying to create an ethical bond across people who do not all share the same customs, languages, gods, or teachers. The astonishing detail is how he speaks. Ashoka does not leave only palace records hidden in archives. He orders messages carved on rocks and pillars across widely separated regions, in Prakrit dialects written mainly in Brahmi script, and in the northwest also in scripts such as Kharosti, with some inscriptions using Greek and Aramaic in frontier zones shaped by earlier Persian and Hellenistic worlds. This is not just communication, it is imperial geography made visible. Stone turns the king's voice into landscape. A traveller, monk, official, merchant, or local inhabitant encounters royal words not in the capital, but beside roads, near settlements, on boulders, on polished pillars that seem almost impossibly smooth for their age. The inscriptions do not reveal every part of Mauryan government, but they prove the empire's desire to be heard across distance. The pillars themselves become symbols of hidden power. Some are made of Chunar sandstone, transported over great distances, shaped and polished with remarkable skill, then set upright with animal capitals that combine authority, artistry, and cosmic suggestion. The lion capital from Sarnath, long after Ashoka's empire has vanished, becomes one of the most recognizable emblems of India. Yet in Ashoka's own age, these pillars are not relics. They are instruments. They announce presence. They mark roots of moral command. They show that the Mauryan state can mobilize quarrying, transport, craftsmen, engineers, and officials across a huge territory. A polished stone column is not only a religious object, it is logistics made beautiful. Ashoka's empire also reveals the limits of power. The inscriptions ask people to behave well because behavior is difficult to control. They urge officials to be fair because officials can be harsh. They praise harmony because conflict exists. They speak of concern for all sex because diversity is real and sometimes tense. The very need to carve the message suggests the fragility beneath the surface. An emperor may command, but he cannot personally transform every village, court, market, monastery and frontier settlement. His voice travels farther than his hand. The moral empire and the administrative empire overlap, but they are not the same thing. Still, the survival of Ashoka's words changes Indian history in a way few rulers manage. For centuries after Zamorius, the inscriptions remain on stone, though their script is eventually forgotten and their author becomes obscure. Only in the modern age is Ashoka fully recovered from his own messages, his name reconnected to the pillars and rocks that had waited in plain sight. That is one of history's quiet ironies. The emperor who tried so hard to speak across his empire became unreadable for a long time, while the stones endured. Under Ashoka, ancient India's hidden power becomes visible in its most unusual form, not merely in armies or treasure, but in the attempt to bind conquest, administration, remorse, and moral instruction into one imperial language. The Mauryan world is vast, disciplined, and ambitious, yet also anxious, aware that force alone cannot hold everything forever. Roads can carry orders, pillars can carry words, officials can carry law, but after Ashoka, the question becomes whether the centre can continue to hold when the emperor's personal authority is gone, and the many regions of India begin once again to pull against the weight of empire. After Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire does not collapse in one clean motion, it loosens. That is often how large states begin to die, not with every wall falling at once, but with distance becoming heavier, obedience becoming slower, and local power remembering that it has roots older than the capital. Pataliputra still stands beside its rivers, still holds the memory of imperial command, still belongs to a dynasty that has ruled across an astonishing stretch of the subcontinent. But the voice that once spoke through polished pillars and rock faces is no longer the voice of the living emperor. Ashoka's successors inherit a realm built by conquest, administration, roads, officials, tribute, moral instruction, and fear. What they do not necessarily inherit is the same authority to make all of it move together. The difficulty begins with scale. The Mauryan Empire is too large to be held by presence alone. From the Gangetic heartland to the northwest, from central India to the edges of the Deccan, power has to pass through governors, military commanders, scribes, tax collectors, local chiefs, city elites, and religious institutions. Each link in that chain can serve the emperor, but each can also develop interests of its own. A provincial official who commands troops and revenue far from Pataliputra may begin as a servant and end as a rival. A local ruling family may accept Mauryan authority while the empire is strong, then quietly reclaim autonomy when the centre weakens. No single explanation fully accounts for the weakening of Mauryan power, but distance is one of the most stubborn forces in the ancient world. It does not rebel dramatically. It simply makes every order more dependent on the loyalty of someone else. Succession adds another pressure. Great empires often look strongest under the ruler who expands or defines them, and then reveal their fragility when that ruler dies. The historical record after Ashoka is thin and uneven, and scholars still debate the sequence, authority, and effective power of his successors. Later sources give names, but not enough detail to reconstruct the inner life of the court with confidence. What survives suggests a dynasty continuing for several decades, yet losing the capacity to command the same vast space. This is important because decline is not the same as instant disappearance. The Mauryan name remains, but the empire behind it may be shrinking, fragmenting, or operating with less force than before. A map can show a large realm in one colour, but ancient reality is rarely so obedient to ink. There is also the question of money. Empires must be fed constantly. Officials require support, armies require payment, grain, animals, equipment, and roads. Forts must be maintained, messengers must move, public works need labour. If a revenue falters, the whole structure begins to strain. Ashoka's inscriptions show concern for welfare, morality, administrative supervision, and religious generosity. But they do not tell us exactly how the imperial budget worked. Some older theories imagined that Ashoka's remorse after Kalinga weakened the military spirit of the empire, but that explanation is too simple and often overstated. The evidence does not support the idea that moral concern alone destroyed Mauryan power. More likely, the empire faced a combination of fiscal pressure, regional resistance, succession problems, administrative overreach, and changing political conditions along its frontiers. The army itself becomes part of the uncertainty. The Mauryans had inherited and expanded a military tradition of immense scale, rooted partly in the Magadhan and Nanda machines before them: war elephants, infantry, cavalry, chariots, forts, and frontier garrisons all require organization. Yet armies are dangerous instruments. If they are too weak, enemies advance. If they are too strong under provincial commanders, generals become kingmakers. Later tradition says the last Mauryan ruler, Brihadratha, was killed by his general Pushyamitra Shunga during a military review. The details come through later sources and must be treated carefully. But the story captures a believable political truth when the centre weakens. The men who control soldiers can decide the fate of dynasties. The fall of a royal house may happen not because the palace is stormed by foreigners, but because someone already inside the imperial system turns the machinery against it. The northwest adds another layer. This region has long been connected to worlds beyond the subcontinent Achaemenid Persia. Alexander's campaigns, Seleucid diplomacy, Hellenistic kingdoms in Bactria, and later Indo-Greek movements. The Mauryas had once reached into this frontier world with strength. Chandragupta had negotiated with Seleucus, and Ashoka had addressed inscriptions in languages that reflected the mixed cultural landscape of the region. But frontiers are difficult to hold when the centre is distracted. As Mauryan power fades, northwestern regions become more open to new rulers and new hybrid formations. This does not mean India is suddenly invaded into silence. It means political space reopens. Greek-speaking elites, local powers, Central Asian groups, and Indian traditions begin to interact in ways that will produce some of the most fascinating forgotten kingdoms of the centuries ahead. Inside the subcontinent, regional worlds also reassert themselves. The Mauryan state had extended influence into parts of the Deccan, but that influence may never have been as uniform as imperial imagination suggests. In many regions, local chiefs, forest groups, merchant communities, and older political lineages remain important beneath the surface. Once the pressure from Pataliputra weakens, these powers can step forward. The empire's roads and administrative habits do not disappear. They become resources for others. The Mauryas had helped connect landscapes, but connection does not guarantee permanent obedience. Sometimes it gives later rivals the very roots they need to build their own power. This is one of the quiet consequences of empire. Even failure leaves infrastructure. Roads survive longer than dynasties. Cities continue after royal families vanish. Scripts spread. Administrative ideas travel. Religious networks deepen. Buddhist communities, Jain communities, Brahmanical institutions, merchants, craft guilds, and land-holding elites all move through the post-Mauryan world, carrying pieces of the old order into new settings. Ashoka's moral inscriptions may no longer function as active imperial commands, but the use of writing for authority has entered the political imagination. The polished pillar remains after the king is gone. A local ruler looking at such monuments can understand the lesson without reading every word. Power becomes more durable when it is made visible. The fall of the Mauryas is therefore not an ending so much as a release of stored energy. The great centralized experiment breaks apart, but the pieces do not return to the world before Magadha. India has changed. Urban networks are stronger. Long-distance trade is more important. Coins circulate. Religious communities have institutional weight. Regional courts have learned from imperial models. The idea of large kingship has been proven possible, even if its permanence has not. What collapses is the single command from Pataliputra. What survives is the memory and technique of command itself. In the shadow after Mauryan power, the map becomes more complicated and more revealing. The north sees new dynasties and frontier kingdoms. The northwest becomes a zone of cultural fusion. The Deccan begins to emerge with greater force, no longer merely a region touched by northern empires, but a political world capable of shaping trade, religion, and power in its own right. The centre could not hold forever, but its loosening allows other hidden empires to come into view. And among the most important of these are the powers of the Deccan, standing between river valleys, cave monasteries, inland routes, and ports where the wider world arrives on monsoon winds. South of the Gangetic heartland, the land changes its rhythm. The Deccan does not open like the northern plains, wide and river-fed in the same continuous way. It rises into plateau, stone, black soil, broken hills, seasonal rivers, forested corridors, mineral zones, and routes that are easy to underestimate if one only looks for imperial capitals. For a long time, histories written from the north treated the Deccan as a space between greater worlds, a passage from the Ganges to the far south, a region touched by empires rather than a maker of them. But after the Mauryan centre weakens, this middle country begins to reveal its own hidden power. It does not simply receive history from elsewhere, it gathers roads, ports, monks, merchants, coins, cave sanctuaries, and dynasties into a different kind of imperial system. The Satavahanas are the clearest example, though even their history comes to us through fragments that do not always fit neatly together. Their chronology remains debated, their early rulers are partly shadowed, and their political reach changes over time. They are remembered through inscriptions, coins, later literary references, and the monumental religious landscapes they helped patronize, directly or indirectly. What survives in the record suggests a dynasty that learned to rule not by copying Magadha, but by mastering the Deccan's connective geography. Their power stretches across inland corridors linking the western coast, the plateau, and the eastern regions. At different moments, they contest western India, influence central India, and connect to ports that look outward to the Arabian Sea and beyond. Their empire is not a single block of control. It is a web. That web depends on movement. Goods travel across the Deccan in ways that make the plateau a bridge rather than a barrier. Cotton textiles, beads, metals, ivory, spices, forest products, and crafted objects move toward markets and ports. Horses, luxury goods, wine, glassware, coral, and coins arrive through maritime trade. The Roman world, far to the west, becomes part of this story not through conquest, but through appetite. Roman demand for Indian goods, especially textiles, spices, gems, and other luxuries, helps intensify commerce across the western coast. Finds of Roman coins in India have often been treated as symbols of this exchange, though scholars still debate how they circulated locally and whether they functioned as currency, bullion, prestige goods, or all of these in different settings. The surprising detail is that an emperor in the Deccan could draw strength not only from farmers under his authority, but from consumers across the sea who would never hear his name. Ports become crucial mouths of this system. Places on the western coast connect inland trade to monsoon shipping. The monsoon winds, once mastered, create predictable seasons of departure and return. Ships do not sail randomly into the ocean. They move with knowledge accumulated over generations by sailors, merchants, pilots, and coastal communities. Inland rulers benefit when they can protect routes, tax goods, support market towns, and associate themselves with religious institutions that merchants trust. Power here is less about one capital commanding everything, and more about controlling flows. A kingdom that understands routes can grow wealthy even without holding every village directly. Cave monasteries show this world with unusual clarity. Across western India, rock-cut Buddhist sites such as Kala, Baja, Nasik, Kanheri, and others stand near trade routes, cut into hillsides with halls, cells, inscriptions, pillars, facades, and spaces designed for religious life and communal memory. These are not remote spiritual refuges in the simple sense. Many are closely tied to merchant networks, guilds, local elites, royal officers, and donors whose inscriptions record gifts of caves, pillars, cisterns, and endowments. A trader gives because devotion matters, but also because monasteries stand within the geography of movement. They offer prestige, trust, lodging, ritual merit, and institutional continuity. In a world where kings rise and fall, a monastery beside a road can become a durable point of connection. The Satavahanas and their rivals understand the value of such patronage. Royal women, officials, merchants, monks, and local notables appear in inscriptions as donors, reminding us that empire is not built by kings alone. Some inscriptions mention queens and mothers with striking prominence, including figures such as Naganika and Gautami Balashri, whose records help preserve dynastic claims and victories. These women are not decorative shadows. They are part of how legitimacy is expressed. Their names survive because public memory needs sponsors, genealogies, and sacred landscapes. The Satavahana world, like many ancient polities, is deeply patriarchal. But the evidence complicates any simple picture in which only kings make history. Coins add another layer. Satavahana coinage appears in varied metals, designs, and regional forms, sometimes bearing Prakrit legends, dynastic symbols, ships, chaityas, animals, and other motifs. Coins do not merely pay soldiers or merchants, they broadcast authority in miniature. A coin can travel where the king never goes. It can cross linguistic and social boundaries. It can suggest control, aspiration, or participation in exchange networks. Yet coins also warn us not to mistake circulation for absolute rule. A coin found far from its place of issue may reflect trade, imitation, movement of metal, or political influence. The evidence remains incomplete, but the spread of coinage reveals a world where economic life is becoming more complex, and where rulers increasingly want their names and symbols moving with goods. The Deccan also becomes a zone of political rivalry. The Satavahanas contend with Western Kshatrapas and other powers for control of routes and regions. Victories are celebrated in inscriptions. Losses are hidden or left to be inferred. Territories shift. Titles grow grand. Claims to universal rule may exceed actual control, as they often do in ancient politics. But these contests are not meaningless exaggerations. They show that the Deccan and Western India are rich enough to fight over repeatedly. Control of this space means access to inland routes, coastal trade, agricultural zones, and symbolic prestige. The struggle itself proves the region's value. Beneath the dynastic names, ordinary life continues in layered forms. Farmers work black cotton soil that can hold moisture but also demands knowledge of season and crop. Pastoralists move animals through dry zones. Iron workers, potters, bead makers, weavers, and quarrymen support both local economies and long-distance exchange. Monks chant in rock-cut halls while merchants count risk. Officials collect dues at crossings. Donors carve their names into stone because stone promises a kind of survival flesh cannot have. No single explanation fully accounts for the Satavahana achievement, because it is not only military, not only religious, not only commercial, it is the joining of all three across a landscape that rewards those who can connect distant worlds. By the time Deccan power fully emerges, ancient India is no longer a story centered only on Pataliputra and the Ganges. The old Mauryan frame has broken, but its aftermath has allowed regional systems to flourish. In the northwest, other forces are also gathering Greek-speaking kings, Central Asian migrants, Iranian traditions, Indian religions, and new forms of art and coinage. While the Deccan builds power through routes between north, south, and sea, the frontier lands are becoming laboratories of another kind of empire, where outsiders become insiders and India's political imagination expands again. At the northwestern edge of the subcontinent, history rarely arrives in a pure form. It comes through passes, river valleys, garrisons, trading towns, mountain roads, and frontier courts where languages overlap and identities become difficult to separate. Long before the great Deccan routes thicken with merchants and cave monasteries, the northwest has already been shaped by the Achaemenid Persians, by Alexander's march, by Seleucid diplomacy, and by the lingering Hellenistic kingdoms that grow out of conquest but cannot remain Greek in any simple way. After Mauryan power withdraws from this frontier, the region does not become empty. It becomes crowded with possibility. Greek-speaking rulers, Iranian lineages, Central Asian groups, Indian elites, merchants, monks, and soldiers meet in a zone where empire is less a wall than a crossing. The Indo-Greeks are often introduced as foreigners, and in origin many of their ruling houses do descend from the Hellenistic world beyond the Hindu Kush. Yet that label becomes less useful the longer they remain in South Asian landscapes. Their coins carry Greek legends, royal portraits, and familiar Hellenistic symbols, but many also carry local scripts and Indian religious imagery. Some rulers issue bilingual coins, speaking simultaneously to different communities, different markets, and different expectations of authority. This is a small object with a large meaning. A coin can reveal a king trying to be understood by more than one world. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact territories and sequences of many Indo-Greek rulers, but the surviving coinage shows political adaptation with extraordinary clarity. Among these kings, Menander stands out, partly because later Buddhist tradition remembers a ruler called Milinda, who engages with the monk Nagasena in philosophical discussion. The text that preserves this memory is not a neutral court record, and its literary form cannot be read as simple history. Still, the association between a Greek-named king and Buddhist intellectual culture is revealing. It suggests that foreign rule in the northwest was not merely military occupation. It could involve patronage, debate, conversion stories, and symbolic participation in local religious life. Whether Menander himself became a Buddhist in the exact way tradition imagines remains debated, But what survives in the record suggests a world in which Buddhist institutions were important enough for kings to notice and, perhaps, support. The Shakas, often identified with Scythian or Central Asian groups, add another layer to this frontier transformation. Moving into northwestern and western India over time, they establish ruling houses that become deeply embedded in Indian political culture. They use titles, issue coins, patronize religious institutions, and compete with other Indian powers such as the Satavahanas, the Western Kshatrapas, one of the most important Shaka-linked formations, rule parts of Western India for centuries, and their inscriptions and coins show a careful blending of political traditions. They are outsiders in origin, but not outsiders in function. They become part of the machinery of Indian kingship. No single explanation fully accounts for this process, because it involves migration, conquest, marriage, trade, local alliance, and the prestige of adapting to established political languages. A surprising detail in this story is that foreignness can become a source of strength and a problem at the same time. A ruler with access to Central Asian cavalry traditions, trans-regional trade links, and frontier military networks may hold advantages over older local powers, but he must also make himself legitimate to subjects, merchants, priests, monks, and regional elites who do not automatically accept him. Coins, inscriptions, donations, titles, and religious patronage become tools of translation. The king does not simply rule by the sword. He must explain himself in symbols that others recognize. This is why frontier empires often produce rich art and complex coinage. They need visual language because words alone cannot hold such diversity together. The Parthian or Pallava presence deepens the mixture further. In the northwest, Indo-Parthian rulers such as Gondophares appear in coins and inscriptions, tied to wider Iranian worlds while ruling in South Asian settings. Their history is fragmentary, and later traditions have attached many stories to them, some far more certain than others. Yet even in fragments, they show that the Northwest is not a border in the modern sense. It is a hinge between cultural zones. Goods move through it. Soldiers move through it. Religious ideas move through it. Artistic forms move through it. Empires rise here not by sealing the frontier, but by feeding on its openness. This openness transforms art in ways that still shape how many people imagine ancient Buddhism. In Gandhara, especially under and around later Kushan influence, sculptors create images that combine South Asian religious themes with artistic vocabularies shaped partly by Hellenistic and Iranian worlds. Draped robes, wavy hair, architectural frames, vine scrolls, guardian figures, and narrative reliefs appear in stone with a style distinct from other Indian regions. Scholars still debate the exact origins and development of the anthropomorphic Buddha image, including the relationship between Gandhara and Mathura. But the broader point is clear frontier contact helps generate new visual forms. The Buddha, once often represented through symbols such as footprints, wheels, trees, or empty thrones, increasingly appears in human form. This is not a small change. It alters devotional imagination across Asia. The Northwest also reveals how military and commercial networks overlap. The same routes that carry armies can carry silk, horses, spices, precious stones, ivory, glass, metalwork, and manuscripts. A ruler controlling a pass or river valley can profit from trade without needing to conquer every place connected to it. This gives frontier kingdoms a different kind of hidden power. They can be smaller than the Mauryan Empire and still matter enormously because they stand at intersections. Their courts hear news from Bactria, the Iranian plateau, the Ganges, the Deccan, and sometimes even farther east and west. Political authority here depends on listening to the movement of the world. Yet these kingdoms are difficult to fit into simple national memory. They do not belong neatly to one later identity. Greek, Shaka, Parthian, and Kushan rulers can appear as invaders in some narratives, as patrons in others, and as cultural bridges in more careful histories. The evidence asks for patience. Some came through violence, some displaced older powers, some taxed and fought like any rulers. But many also became part of Indian society's long pattern of absorption and transformation. The subcontinent did not remain unchanged by them, and they did not remain unchanged by the subcontinent. By the time Kushan power rises more fully, the frontier has already prepared the ground. Coinage has become cosmopolitan. Buddhist institutions have grown along routes. Artistic workshops have learned to speak in blended forms. Iranian, Central Asian, Greek, and Indian political languages have begun to overlap. The hidden power of these foreign kings is not that they interrupted Indian history from outside, but that they reveal how porous and adaptive ancient India could be. At the crossings of mountains and rivers, the next great empire will turn this mixture into something even larger, a realm that links India not only to its neighbours, but to the great arteries of Eurasia. The Kushan Empire rises from the same frontier mixture that has already reshaped the northwest, but it expands the meaning of that frontier until it becomes almost a world system. Its roots lie among the Yuezhi groups who moved out of Inner Asia after pressures and conflicts far beyond India's borders, eventually forming powerful ruling houses in Bactria, and then extending influence southward across the Hindu Kush. By the time the Kushans become a major imperial force, they are no longer simply migrants from the steppe or conquerors from beyond the mountains. They are rulers of a vast crossroads, commanding territories that connect Central Asia, Afghanistan, northwestern India, and parts of the Gangetic world. Their empire does not feel like a closed container. It feels like a knot tied around the arteries of Eurasia. This is why Kushan power is easy to underestimate if one looks only for a single capital or a single cultural identity. The empire's strength lies in movement across zones that other states struggle to connect. From Bactria, routes lead west toward Iran and the Roman world. Through mountain corridors, they descend into Gandhara and the Punjab. Across northern India, they reach toward Mathura and the rich religious and commercial landscapes of the Ganges region, north and east. Caravan routes connect to the Tarim Basin and, beyond that, to Han China. The famous Silk Road is not one road, and it is not only silk, it is a changing network of paths carrying textiles, horses, glass, metals, spices, gems, ideas, diseases, stories, and sacred images. The Kushan stand close to its beating centre. Their coinage reveals the scale of their imagination. Kushan gold coins, especially from the reigns of rulers such as Vima Kadphises and Kanishka, are among the most striking objects of ancient Eurasia. They show kings in heavy coats and boots, sometimes standing beside altars, sometimes surrounded by divine names and figures drawn from Iranian, Greek, Indian, and other traditions. On Kushan coins, one can encounter gods associated with Shiva, Iranian deities, the Buddha, and names written in Greek-derived script using the Bactrian language. This is not confusion, it is imperial translation. A Kushan ruler speaks to many communities at once, using metal as a travelling court proclamation. A coin passed from soldier to merchant to monk may carry a message more adaptable than any inscription fixed in stone. Kanishka, the most famous Kushan emperor, stands at the centre of this story, though even his chronology has long been debated. Scholars still debate the exact date of his accession and the sequence of early Kushan expansion, because the evidence remains incomplete and must be assembled from coins, inscriptions, Chinese histories, Buddhist traditions, and archaeology. Yet his historical importance is clear. Under Kanishka and his dynasty, the Kushan realm becomes one of the great patrons of Buddhism, while also supporting a wider religious world. Buddhist tradition associates Kanishka with the Great Council and with the flourishing of Mahayana Buddhism, though the details are difficult to verify. What survives in the record suggests that Kushan patronage helped Buddhist institutions, images, texts, and missions move across Central Asia toward China, where they would eventually transform the religious history of East Asia. The surprising detail is that Buddhism's expansion is not carried only by monks sitting in quiet meditation. It travels with merchants, translators, caravan leaders, donors, and political protection. A monastery near a trade route is a spiritual refuge, but also a place of storage, lodging, exchange, and trust. A merchant crossing dangerous terrain may give to a monastery because he seeks merit, safety, reputation, or all of these together. Kushan rule helps stabilize certain corridors and enriches cities where such institutions can thrive. In this way, an empire built partly on military conquest and long-distance commerce becomes one of the great vehicles for religious transmission. No single explanation fully accounts for the spread of Buddhism across Asia, but Kushan networks are one of its most important hidden engines. Art gives the Kushan world a visible face. In Gandhara, sculptors work in grey schist and stucco, shaping scenes from the Buddha's life with draped garments, architectural frames, and human figures that reflect several artistic inheritances. In Mathura, artists produce powerful red sandstone images rooted in local Indian forms, including early representations of the Buddha, bodhisattvas, yakshas, and Jain figures. The relationship between Gandhara and Mathura remains one of the great debates in the history of South Asian art, especially concerning the emergence of the Buddha image. But the broader transformation is undeniable. Under and around Kushan patronage, sacred presence becomes more embodied, more portable, more visually direct. The divine and enlightened are no longer only suggested through symbols. They stand before worshippers in human form. Cities flourish in this world of exchange. Purushapura, often identified with Peshawar, becomes associated with Kanishka's monumental stupa, remembered by later Chinese pilgrims as one of the wonders of the Buddhist world. Mathura becomes a major religious and artistic centre, sacred to multiple traditions. Taxila, already ancient by this time, continues to reflect the layered history of the Northwest. These cities are not isolated jewels. They are nodes in a network where artisans, monks, administrators, merchants, and soldiers all depend on imperial conditions. The Kushans benefit from trade between Rome and Asia, from gold flows, from taxes, and from the prestige of ruling across cultural frontiers. But their wealth is never purely economic. It is also symbolic. To command crossroads is to appear larger than the land one directly controls. Yet the Kushan Empire also reveals the fragility of being a crossroads power. The same openness that brings wealth also brings pressure. Sasanian expansion in Iran, changing Central Asian dynamics, local Indian powers, and shifts in trade all affect Kushan authority. Over time, the empire fragments, with later Kushan and Kushano-Sasanian formations preserving pieces of its legacy. Its decline is not a clean disappearance. It is more like a dispersal of forms, coin types, religious images, artistic conventions, trade habits, and political titles continue in altered settings. The empire fades, but the networks it strengthened do not vanish. The Kushans are forgotten only if history is told too narrowly. They are essential if ancient India is understood as part of Eurasia, rather than as a sealed civilization. Their hidden power lies in connection between Rome's appetite and India's goods, between Central Asian roots and Buddhist monasteries, between Iranian gods and Indian deities, between Greek artistic inheritance and South Asian sacred forms, between royal gold and spiritual transformation. They show that some empires matter less because they impose sameness than because they make difference move. As their power thins and regional kingdoms reassert themselves, another vision of empire begins to gather in the Gangetic world, one remembered later as a golden age, though its light is more complicated than the phrase suggests. The Gupta world rises in the Gangetic heartland with a different kind of glow from the Mauryan one. It does not speak across the subcontinent in the same stern voice of polished pillars and imperial commands, and it does not seem to hold territory with the same centralized weight that once made Pataliputra the nerve center of Ashoka's realm. Its power is more courtly, more layered, more dependent on alliance, marriage, conquest, prestige, tribute, and the careful performance of kingship. Later memory often calls this period a golden age, and there is truth behind the phrase if one looks at literature, mathematics, astronomy, religious art, temple architecture, and the refinement of Sanskrit political culture. But gold can hide shadows. The Gupta age is brilliant, yet it is not simple. Beneath the language of universal sovereignty lies a landscape of regional rulers, negotiated loyalties, frontier pressures, and communities whose lives are not always illuminated by court poetry. The rise begins with the dynasty that first appears modest beside the huge empires that came before. Early Gupta rulers likely control a limited base in the eastern Gangetic region, but under Chandragupta I and especially Samudragupta, their ambition expands dramatically. Samudragupta's achievements are preserved most famously in the Allahabad pillar inscription, composed in ornate Sanskrit on a pillar originally associated with Ashoka. That detail alone is striking. A Mauryan monument becomes a Gupta surface, and the memory of one empire is physically reused by another. The inscription praises Samudragupta as a conqueror of extraordinary range, listing defeated kings, frontier rulers, forest chiefs, and southern powers who are conquered, released, subdued, or made tributary in different ways. It is not a neutral report. It is royal praise, shaped to magnify the king. Scholars still debate how much actual control lay behind each claim. But even allowing for exaggeration, the inscription shows a sophisticated political imagination. Not every defeated ruler has to be annexed. Some are more useful as dependent kings, tribute bearers, or symbols of submission. This is one of the hidden strengths of Gupta power. It does not always need direct rule to project supremacy. In some core regions, Gupta authority is likely firmer, supported by officials, land revenue, and urban centres. In wider zones, influence may work through subordinate rulers, marriage alliances, military campaigns, and ritual claims. The title of emperor matters, but so does the ability to make other kings acknowledge it. This creates a looser imperial structure than the Mauryan model, but not necessarily a weaker one in every respect. A flexible empire can reach far without paying the full cost of direct administration everywhere. Yet flexibility has a price. When the centre weakens, those same subordinate rulers can become independent with alarming ease. At court, the Guptas help elevate Sanskrit as a language of power, beauty, and political legitimacy. Sanskrit had long existed as a sacred and learned language, but in this period it becomes increasingly prominent in inscriptions, royal praise, literary culture, and elite self-presentation. Kings do not merely rule, they are described through poetry, genealogy, divine comparison, and cosmic order. Courtly language makes politics shimmer. It turns conquest into destiny and patronage into moral radiance. The famous poet and dramatist Kalidasa is often associated with the Gupta age, though exact details of his life remain uncertain. His works reveal a world of refined aesthetic imagination, where mountains, seasons, longing, kingship, and divine presence are woven into elegant form. The political importance of such culture should not be underestimated. Beauty can legitimize power as surely as armies can. Science and mathematics also give the Gupta period its lasting reputation. Indian mathematical traditions develop concepts and techniques that will eventually influence the wider world, including work with place value, astronomy, geometry, and calculation. Aryabhata, slightly later in the broad classical age, writes on mathematics and astronomy with remarkable sophistication, including methods for calculating planetary positions and an understanding of Earth's rotation that stands out in intellectual history. The evidence does not allow every later achievement to be simply assigned to the Gupta court itself, and scholars are careful about broad Golden Age claims, but what survives suggests an environment in which learned traditions, institutions, patronage, and intellectual exchange allow complex sciences to flourish. This is power of another kind. Not the command of armies, but the ability to preserve and refine abstract knowledge across generations. Religious life changes visibly in stone and sculpture. Earlier sacred landscapes had been dominated in many regions by stupas, monasteries, railings, and rock-cut spaces, but the Gupta period sees important developments in structural temple building and iconic Hindu art. Vishnu, Shiva, the goddess, and other divine forms take increasingly elaborate visual shape. Temples become more than ritual sites. They become political markers, landholders, artistic workshops, and centres of local identity. The famous Dashavatara temple at Deogar, among others, suggests a world in which stone architecture is beginning to express sacred kingship and cosmic order in new ways. At the same time, Buddhism and Jainism continue to thrive in many regions. The Gupta world is not a simple story of one religion replacing another. It is a competitive and creative religious landscape where patronage, devotion, philosophy, and local practice overlap. Land grants become another hidden mechanism. Rulers and elites grant land to Brahmins, temples, monasteries, and officials, often recorded on copper plates or inscriptions. These grants can support religious merit, reward service, extend agriculture, and bind local elites to royal authority. But they can also shift power away from the centre by giving beneficiaries control over revenue, labour obligations, and local rights. Over time, such grants help transform the political economy. The king appears generous, but generosity can decentralise authority. No single explanation fully accounts for the changing structure of Gupta and post-Gupta society. But land grants are one of the important clues. They show empire not only as conquest, but as redistribution of rights over soil and people. The shadows grow clearer in the later Gupta period. Frontier pressures increase, especially from groups often identified as Hunas, connected to wider Central Asian movements. These incursions do not alone explain Gupta decline, but they place serious strain on already complex structures. Regional powers strengthen. Revenue patterns shift. Succession disputes may weaken the dynasty. Trade networks change. The great imperial language remains, but the political world beneath it fragments. What had once allowed Gupta power to expand flexibly now makes it difficult to hold together. Subordinate rulers need only stop pretending that submission still matters. And yet, like the Mauryas, the Guptas do not vanish cleanly. Their legacy spreads through forms Sanskrit political inscriptions, temple models, coin imagery, religious iconography, mathematical traditions, courtly ideals, and the memory of kings whose prestige outlives their control. The Gupta age matters not because it was a perfect golden world, but because it refined languages of power that later Indian kingdoms would use again and again. Its light is real, but so are the shadows at its edge. As northern power fragments, southern India gathers strength in its own distinctive ways, not merely imitating the north, but turning temples, ports, poetry, and ocean routes into the foundations of another kind of empire. As the northern imperial map loosens and reforms, southern India is not waiting at the edge of history. It has its own old rhythms, its own political memories, its own sacred landscapes, and its own routes to power. Here the rivers do not spread like the Ganges plain, in one immense belt of alluvial command. They descend from hills, cross fertile valleys, break toward coasts, and feed regions where agriculture, trade, poetry, and temple patronage grow together. The far south looks inward to wet fields, pastoral zones, hill products, and warrior lineages, but it also looks outward across the sea. The ocean is not a boundary. It is a road that moves with the monsoon, carrying pearls, pepper, textiles, horses, gold, ideas, and the prestige of distant contact. In this world, power does not always begin with a huge land army. Sometimes it begins at a port. The early Tamil polities remembered in Sangam literature, especially the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas, stand at the beginning of this southern political imagination. The poems are rich with kings, warriors, lovers, bards, cattle raids, battlefields, seashores, hill country, generosity, grief, and fame. They are not court chronicles in a modern sense, and scholars still debate their dating, layers, and relationship to specific historical events, yet they preserve something invaluable. The feel of a society where prestige flows through gift-giving, war, poetry, trade, and landscape. A king proves himself not only by conquering, but by feeding poets, rewarding warriors, protecting prosperity, and placing his name within memory. In a world before many long inscriptions, poetry becomes an archive of honour. The Pandyas are closely tied to the pearl-rich coast around the Gulf of Mannar, where divers descend into dangerous waters for objects small enough to rest on a fingertip, but valuable enough to attract merchants from far away. Pearl fishing is not romantic labour. It is seasonal, risky, and dependent on knowledge of banks, currents, boats, markets, and royal claims. A ruler who controls pearl fisheries controls luxury at its source. the Cheras, associated with the western coast and the interior routes of Kerala and Tamil regions, benefit from access to pepper and other goods desired across the Indian Ocean and beyond. The early Cholas, connected to the fertile Kaveri basin, draw strength from agriculture and riverine settlement that will later support one of the most powerful temple-centered states in Indian history. These polities rise, fade, and reappear across centuries, but their names endure because they attach themselves to land, product, and memory. Trade with the Mediterranean world gives southern India an especially wide horizon. Roman coins, amphora fragments, beads, and literary references all point to intense exchange between the Indian Ocean and the Western world in the early centuries of the Common Era. Ports such as Muziris, whose exact archaeological identification remains debated, became almost legendary as points of contact between Indian merchants and ships from the Red Sea world. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a coastline alive with brokers, sailors, warehouse keepers, translators, tax collectors, and rulers eager to profit from the movement of goods. A surprising detail is that ancient South Indian power could be shaped by tastes in faraway Roman households. A desire for pepper, pearls, ivory, and fine textiles could strengthen rulers whose subjects never saw Rome and never needed to. But southern power is never only maritime. Inland agriculture matters profoundly, especially in river valleys where irrigation and wet rice cultivation can support dense settlement. The Kaveri Basin becomes one of the great agricultural foundations of the south. Managing water here requires embankments, channels, tanks, sluices, local cooperation, and authority capable of organizing labor. Over time, those who master irrigation also master society. A temple, a village assembly, a royal officer, and a land-holding elite may all become entangled in the management of water and revenue. No single explanation fully accounts for the later strength of southern kingdoms, because it comes from the joining of field and sea, ritual and market, local assembly and royal ambition. The Pallavas bring another transformation, especially from their base around Kanchipuram. Their rise belongs to a changing post-Gupta and early medieval world in which Sanskritic kingship, Tamil cultural life, Brahmanical religion, and regional politics all interact. They are patrons of architecture and learning, and under rulers such as Mahendravarman and Narasimhavarman, Pallava power is expressed in both war and stone, rock-cut shrines, structural temples, and the monuments of Mamallapuram show a new confidence in sacred architecture as political language. The great relief often called the Descent of the Ganges or Arjuna's penance is not merely decoration. It is a world carved into stone gods, ascetics, animals, river symbolism, royal imagination, and cosmic order gathered on a surface that still feels alive. The Pallavas also show that southern kingdoms are deeply connected to wider Asian worlds. Scripts, religious ideas, and artistic forms move from South India into Southeast Asia through trade, migration, diplomacy, and religious networks. This does not mean South Indian rulers simply colonized Southeast Asia in a modern imperial sense. The process is more complex, involving local Southeast Asian elites actively adopting, adapting, and transforming Indian models of kingship, writing, temple ritual, and Sanskrit prestige. The evidence remains debated in many details, but the broader movement is clear. Southern India becomes one of the great cultural transmitters of the Indian Ocean, not by a single conquest, but through centuries of contact. Meanwhile, the Pandyas, Cheras, And early Cholas continue to compete for prestige, land, ports, and sacred legitimacy. Their rivalries are not side stories. They create the political field from which later Chola expansion will emerge. Temples grow in importance as places where kings can plant authority in stone, where gods become patrons of cities, where land grants are recorded, where bronze and music and ritual bind communities across generations. A temple is a house of worship, but also an employer, landlord, archive, treasury, festival centre, and marker of royal presence. In the south, empire will increasingly be written not only in inscriptions of conquest, but in the daily repetition of ritual. The ocean remains in the background like a second sky. Ships leave with the monsoon, return with another wind, and bring back objects that widen the imagination of courts and merchants. Horses arrive from overseas because the humid south is not ideal for breeding the war horses that elite armies desire. This dependence on imported horses becomes a recurring strategic problem in Indian history. Control of ports can mean control of cavalry supply, pepper vines, pearl banks, textile workshops. And horse markets all belong to the same political world, even if they seem unrelated at first glance. By the time the early Cholas begin to gather the forces that will later make them famous, southern India has already built the foundations of oceanic power. The field, the port, the poem, and the temple have become interlocking sources of authority. The forgotten strength of the south lies in this combination. It does not need to imitate the Mauryas or Guptas to matter. It creates its own grammar of empire, one that will eventually send fleets across the Bay of Bengal and build temples so vast that they make royal ambition look almost geological. Behind the visible rise of kings, another India keeps working in quieter ways. It does not always announce itself through battles, royal titles, or the founding of capitals. It lives in monasteries beside trade roads, in guild halls where merchants pool trust, in irrigation tanks repaired before the rains, in copper plate grants stored by religious communities, in temple treasuries, in caravan rest houses, in ports where scribes record dues, and in schools where knowledge moves farther than armies. This hidden infrastructure is one reason ancient Indian civilization remains so resilient even when dynasties break. A royal house may vanish after a failed succession or a lost war, but a monastery with land, donors, students, manuscripts, and merchant ties can continue breathing through the ruins of politics. By the early centuries of the Common Era and into the centuries after the Guptas, religious institutions become some of the most durable bodies in the landscape. Buddhist monasteries, Jain establishments, Brahmanical temples, and later great temple complexes do far more than perform ritual. They receive gifts, manage land, employ workers, host travellers, store grain or valuables, preserve texts, commission art, and shape local economies. A donation carved into stone may look like a small pious act, but behind it stands a social world of surplus, reputation, and memory. The donor wants merit, but also permanence. A merchant whose caravan faces dangerous roads may give to a monastery near a pass. A queen may sponsor a shrine to strengthen dynastic prestige. A village assembly may recognize a temple's rights because sacred authority and economic order have become tangled together. The great Buddhist learning centers reveal this hidden power with unusual force. Nalanda, which grows especially prominent in the Gupta and post-Gupta world, and later flourishes under Pala patronage, becomes much more than a monastery. It is a residential university in the older sense of the word, a place of teachers, students, libraries, debate, discipline, ritual, and international reputation. Chinese pilgrims such as Xuanzang and Yijing later describe its intellectual life with admiration, though their accounts must be read carefully, shaped as they are by Buddhist concerns and the expectations of travel writing. Still, what survives in the record suggests a vast institution supported by endowments and royal gifts, drawing monks from across Asia and preserving knowledge in philosophy, logic, grammar, medicine, and religious doctrine. Its power is not military, yet kings respect it because learning can become prestige, and prestige can become legitimacy. Monasteries like Nalanda depend on networks. They require food for residents, materials for buildings, scribes for manuscripts, donors for maintenance, and political conditions stable enough for students to travel. This means that intellectual history is never separate from roads and fields. A monk studying subtle arguments about consciousness may eat grain harvested by tenant farmers on endowed land. A manuscript may exist because merchants, rulers, or local elites support the copying of texts. A debate in a monastery hall may depend on the same trade routes that carry cloth, salt, and metal. The surprising detail is that some of ancient India's greatest centres of thought are also economic organisms, rooted in land and exchange as much as in doctrine. Guilds form another layer of this invisible empire. Artisans and merchants organised by occupation, region, or shared interest. And in many places, these groups develop enough collective identity to appear in inscriptions as donors and corporate actors, weavers, oil pressers, metal workers, ivory carvers, bankers, caravan merchants, and ship-owning communities all participate in the wider economy. The exact structure of ancient Indian guilds varies by time and place, and scholars still debate how much autonomy or legal authority they possessed in different periods. But their importance is clear. They create trust beyond kinship. They help regulate craft standards, credit, apprenticeship, and trade. They can make donations as a group, move capital, and support religious institutions. A king may claim to command prosperity, but merchants often know the practical routes through which prosperity actually moves. Money and credit deepen these relationships. Coins circulate in some regions and periods with great intensity, while in others economic life depends more heavily on goods, land rights, grain shares, and local exchange. The idea of a single uniform economy across ancient India is misleading. The evidence remains incomplete and uneven, yet inscriptions show donations of permanent endowments, interest-bearing deposits, and arrangements in which guilds manage funds for religious purposes. A donor may give money to a guild, and the interest may support lamps, monks' robes, feeding houses, or temple rituals. This is a remarkable kind of continuity sacred life funded through commercial trust. The flame in a shrine may burn because a guild has promised to maintain it from the profits of its work. Land grants become one of the most consequential mechanisms of hidden power. Kings and regional rulers grant villages, fields, tax rights, and privileges to Brahmins, temples, monasteries, and officials. These grants are often recorded on copper plates, durable documents meant to protect rights across generations. At first glance, they look like generosity, but they also reorganize authority. When a ruler grants land, he may be extending agriculture into frontier zones, rewarding allies, gaining religious merit, or planting loyal institutions in contested territory. At the same time, he may be giving away revenue that once flowed directly to the court. Over time, local beneficiaries gain power over labour, taxation, and dispute settlement. No single explanation fully accounts for the long-term effects of land grants, but they clearly help create a more localized political order in which temples, Brahmins, monasteries, and landed elites become essential. Irrigation is the other hidden skeleton of power. In many regions, especially in the south and Deccan, tanks, canals, wells, embankments, and reservoirs make agriculture reliable enough to support dense settlement and temple-centered society. These systems require maintenance, not just construction. Silt must be cleared, bunds must be repaired, water must be allocated, disputes must be settled before they become violence. Inscriptions often record gifts for tanks or repairs to waterworks. Because such acts are both practical and sacred, a ruler who gives water gives life, but local communities often do the daily labour that keeps the system alive. Empire may take credit for irrigation, yet its survival depends on village cooperation and inherited technical knowledge. This is why ancient India's forgotten power cannot be measured only by the size of armies. The most durable forces are often those that make society continue after armies leave religious institutions that preserve memory, guilds that sustain trust, irrigation systems that feed populations, merchant networks that cross political borders, and land grants that reshape ownership in ways later rulers must respect. These are slow powers. They do not glitter like conquest, but they outlast it. When the political landscape shifts again toward rival temple-building dynasties, the kings who rise will build upon this hidden infrastructure. They will carve mountains, raise shrines, endow monasteries, and use sacred architecture as a weapon of memory. Because by now every ambitious ruler understands that power must live not only in the court, but in stone, water, land, and ritual. By the time power gathers again around the great temple-building dynasties, kings have learned that stone can do what armies cannot. Armies can seize a city, burn a rival's granary, force tribute, and place a banner over a fortress, but stone can remain after the army has marched away. A temple cut into rock or raised from dressed blocks can turn a landscape into a statement of authority. It can say that a ruler is favoured by the gods, that his dynasty belongs to cosmic order, that his capital is not merely a political centre, but a sacred axis. After the age of the Guptas and the long growth of land grants, monasteries, guilds, and irrigation networks, the most ambitious Indian kings increasingly understand that empire must be built not only through conquest, but through memory. If a ruler wants his power to survive distance, rivalry, and death, he must make it visible in places people cannot ignore. The Chalukyas of Badami are among the dynasties that reveal this transformation with force. Rising in the Deccan, they occupy a region where northern and southern styles, languages, trade routes, and sacred traditions meet. Their capital at Vatapi, now Badami, sits amid red sandstone cliffs, water tanks, and rugged terrain that seems almost designed for political theatre. Here, rock-cut caves and structural temples become instruments of royal presence. The stone is not passive. It is carved into shrines for Vishnu, Shiva, just figures, and other sacred forms, showing a world where religious patronage is both devotion and strategy. A king who sponsors many traditions can speak to many communities at once. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact relationships between workshop movement, regional style, and royal intention. but what survives suggests that Chalukya art was deliberately placed at a crossroads of culture and power. Their rivalry with the Pallavas sharpens this politics of stone. In the 7th century, Chalukya and Pallava kings fight for prestige, territory, and symbolic dominance across the Deccan and Tamil regions. Pulakeshin II, one of the most celebrated Chalukya rulers, expands power widely and is remembered for resisting the northern emperor Harsha, a tale preserved in inscriptions that naturally magnify royal achievement. Yet victory and defeat both leave marks. The Pallavas attack Vatepi. Chalukya rulers later strike back toward Kanchipuram. These wars are not only military events, they are contests over which court can claim to stand at the centre of the world. Temples, inscriptions, and titles become weapons after the battle is over. A king may lose a campaign, but if his poets and sculptors preserve a different image, memory itself becomes disputed ground. At Patadakal, the Chalukya ambition becomes especially visible. Temples stand near the Malaprabha River, combining forms often described as northern and southern in ways that are too rich to reduce to simple borrowing. Towers, halls, sculpted panels, and ritual spaces create an architectural conversation across regions. The Virupaksha temple, commissioned by Queen Lokamahadevi to celebrate her husband Vikramaditya II's victory over the Pallavas, is one of the most striking examples of royal women shaping sacred and political memory. This is a lesser-known but crucial detail. Queens are not merely present beside kings. They can be patrons who translate victory into permanent stone. The temple becomes a trophy more durable than captured goods. It turns military success into sacred architecture, placing dynastic glory under divine protection. The Rashtrakutas, who later rise from the Deccan and overshadow the Chalukyas, take this idea even further. Their empire stretches across large parts of the subcontinent at different times, competing with the Palas in the east and the Gujara Pratiharas in the north and west in a long struggle often called the tripartite contest for control of Kannauj. Kannauj matters because it carries the prestige of northern kingship, a city whose possession signals more than practical advantage. To claim it is to claim a place in the political imagination of India. Yet the Rashtrakutas' deepest surviving statement is not at Kannauj. It is at Ellora, where the Kailasa temple is cut downward from living rock with such audacity that it still seems almost unbelievable even when one stands before it. The Kailasa temple, associated especially with Krishna I, is not built in the ordinary sense. It is excavated from a single mass of basalt, carved from top to bottom, releasing a freestanding temple from the mountain. This is architecture as conquest over stone itself. It represents Mount Kailasa, the mythic home of Shiva, but it also represents royal power capable of organizing labor, design, engineering, sculpture, and sacred ambition on a monumental scale. No single explanation fully accounts for how such a project was planned and executed in every detail. The technical process remains a subject of admiration and study. What is clear is that the Rashtrakutas used sacred architecture to make a claim no inscription alone could equal their rule, could transform the earth into a cosmic mountain. Ellora also reveals India's layered religious world. Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain monuments stand in proximity, created across different periods and under different patrons. This does not mean there was never rivalry or tension. It means the sacred landscape was cumulative. Dynasties inherited places already thick with meaning and added their own claims. A ruler did not always need to erase the past. Sometimes he could dominate it by placing his monument beside it, larger, bolder, more elaborate. Sacred geography becomes a field of competition, but also of continuity. The old monastery, the new temple, the Jain shrine, the royal inscription, the pilgrim path, and the artisan's chisel all share the same stone horizon. In the east, the palace create another kind of power, rooted in Bengal and Bihar, regions of rivers, monasteries, agrarian expansion, and Buddhist prestige. Pala rulers such as Dharmapala and Devapala support major monastic universities, including Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapuri, and others, helping make eastern India one of the great intellectual centres of the Buddhist world. Their patronage reaches beyond regional politics into trans-Asian religious networks, monks, manuscripts, images, and teachings move toward Tibet, Nepal, Southeast Asia, and other regions. The Palas are kings, not merely protectors of monks, and they fight for territory like other rulers, but their hidden power lies partly in scholarship and sacred diplomacy. A monastery under Pala patronage can carry the dynasty's prestige farther than an army. Pala art, with its refined bronze and stone images of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, goddesses, and tantric deities, becomes influential across Asia. These images are not simply beautiful objects. They are portable theology, moving through networks of teachers, pilgrims, and patrons. At the same time, Brahmanical traditions also flourish in Pala territories, reminding us again that ancient India rarely fits into a single religious category. The political use of religion is not always exclusive. Kings may support multiple traditions, whether from devotion, diplomacy, local necessity, or the desire to gather legitimacy from every available source. The Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, and Palas show that by this age, power has become deeply architectural. A king's reach is measured not only by land conquered, but by monuments raised, mountains carved, temples endowed, monasteries protected, and sacred places attached to his name. These dynasties are forgotten only when history looks for one continuous empire and misses the rival centres that shaped the subcontinent in fragments. Their world is one of competing capitals, sacred landscapes, and stone arguments, and from this world of temple power, one southern dynasty will eventually build a machine even more integrated, where the temple becomes archive, treasury, ritual theatre, administrative centre, and imperial monument all at once. The Cholas will take the grammar of sacred kingship and carry it across the sea. The Chola rise begins in the fertile Kaveri basin, but their ambition does not remain confined to the river. The Kaveri is their deep root, a landscape of wet fields, canals, tanks, villages, and temples, where rice agriculture can sustain dense populations and give rulers the surplus needed for armies, artisans, priests, scribes, and monumental building. Yet the Cholas also face the sea, and this gives their power a second horizon. Earlier southern kingdoms had understood the ocean as a road, not a boundary, but under the imperial Cholas that road becomes part of statecraft. Their world joins field and fleet, bronze and inscription, temple and treasury, village assembly and royal command. The Cholas do not appear from nowhere. Their name is old, preserved in early Tamil traditions, but the imperial dynasty rises with new force from the 9th century onward. Vijayalaya Chola establishes a foothold at Thanjavur, and later rulers expand through warfare, alliance, and administration. Under Rajaraja I and his son Rajendra I, Chola power reaches an extraordinary height. They defeat rivals in the Tamil region, move into Sri Lanka, contest the Deccan, and project influence across the Bay of Bengal. The evidence remains incomplete in some areas, especially when royal inscriptions present conquest in triumphant language. But what survives suggests a state capable of converting military success into durable rule. The great symbol of Rajaraja's reign is the Brihadisvara temple at Thanjavur, a monument so controlled in its design that it feels like a royal command turned into granite. Its tower rises above the flat riverine landscape with deliberate dominance. The temple is dedicated to Shiva, but it is also an imperial archive. Inscriptions on its walls record gifts of land, gold, lamps, livestock, dancers, musicians, accountants, guards, cooks, ritual specialists, and systems of maintenance. This is the surprising detail that reveals the Chola machine most clearly. A temple can preserve not only devotion, but payroll. It shows how ritual requires administration, and how administration gains sacred permanence when carved into stone. The Chola temple is not only a place where worship happens, it is a landholder, employer, storehouse, performance centre, political symbol, and memory device. Oil must be supplied for lamps, musicians must be paid, bronze images must be clothed, carried, bathed, and honoured. Festival routes must be maintained. Fields granted to the temple must be measured and taxed or exempted according to specific arrangements. Villages and assemblies interact with royal orders, local donors, and temple authorities. No single explanation fully accounts for how power worked in every Chola locality, because control varied across regions and depended on negotiation with local elites. But the inscriptions show a world where sacred life and bureaucratic life are intertwined. Chola bronzes carry this system into motion. The famous bronze images of Shiva as Nataraja, of Parvati, Vishnu, saints, and other divine figures are not merely museum objects, though later centuries have often made them so. In their living context, they are processional icons, made to move. The stone temple anchors the god in place. The bronze image allows the god to enter the streets, fields, and festival crowds. This movement has political meaning as well as religious force. When the deity travels through the community, the sacred centre touches the social body. When the king gives bronze, gold, land, or ritual support, he ties his authority to divine presence. The Chola genius lies in this union of immensity and intimacy, granite for permanence, bronze for movement. Rajendra I takes the imperial imagination even farther. His campaigns reach northward toward the Ganges, at least in the symbolic and military terms celebrated by inscriptions, and he establishes a new capital called Gangaikonda Cholapuram, the city of the Chola who took the Ganges. Whether every detail of the northern expedition should be read literally remains debated, but its meaning is clear. Rajendra wants to claim not only land, but prestige. Bringing the sacred geography of the north into a southern imperial title says that the Cholas are not regional kings at the edge of India. They stand within the subcontinent's greatest tradition of universal sovereignty, but with a southern accent and an oceanic reach. That oceanic reach becomes most dramatic in the Chola expedition against Srivijaya in the early 11th century. Srivijaya, based in Southeast Asia, controls key maritime routes around the Straits of Malacca and participates in traffic between India, China, and the island world. Chola inscriptions celebrate attacks on places associated with this network. Scholars still debate the causes and consequences of the campaign. It may have involved trade competition, diplomatic tensions, protection of merchant interests, royal prestige, or several of these together. It was not a simple conquest followed by permanent occupation, but the expedition proved something extraordinary. A South Indian dynasty could organize naval force across the Bay of Bengal and intervene in Southeast Asian maritime politics. Merchant guilds help explain how such reach is possible. Groups such as the Enuruvar, Manigramam, and other trading corporations appear in inscriptions across South India and beyond, connected to long-distance commerce, temples, and ports. They move through a world of textiles, spices, precious goods, horses, aromatics, metals, and ritual donations. Their presence in Southeast Asia shows that trade is organized by people with names, institutions, gods, privileges, ships, risks, and memories. The hidden power of the Cholas is not that the state controls every merchant, but that royal ambition and commercial movement can reinforce one another. Sri Lanka becomes another crucial part of the Chola story. Chola invasions and occupation affect the island deeply, disrupting older kingdoms, moving wealth, and integrating parts of the island into imperial administration for a time. Yet control is contested, and local resistance continues. Here the harder face of empire is visible. Temples and bronzes can dazzle, but armies extract, seize, and impose. The same administrative skill that maintains lamps in Thanjavur can also move revenue from conquered lands. By the later Chola period, pressures mount from the Pandyas, Hoysalas, Sinhala resistance, changing trade patterns, and internal strains. The great machine does not stop at once. It slows, adapts, loses territories, and becomes one power among others before fading from imperial dominance. But its legacy remains unusually tangible. The Kaveri temples still stand. The inscriptions still speak in long lists of gifts and obligations. The bronzes still hold the grace of movement even when motion has ceased. The Chola ocean machine survives not as a single empire on a map, but as a memory of how a river valley learned to face the sea and turn devotion, administration, trade, and conquest into one of the most remarkable forms of power ancient India ever produced. The forgotten empires of ancient India do not disappear because they were small. Many were not small at all. They commanded armies, roads, ports, monasteries, temples, treasuries, farms, forests, coins, and sacred landscapes. Some ruled across distances that would have exhausted weaker states. Some shaped trade between Rome, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. Some built monuments so vast that they still dominate the land long after the languages of their courts have changed. Yet memory is not fair, and history is not a perfect ledger. Certain names rise easily to the surface: Ashoka, the Guptas, the Cholas. Others remain below, visible only through fragments, because the record is uneven, because later dynasties rewrote prestige around themselves, because inscriptions broke, because manuscript burned, because oral memory transformed politics into legend, and because modern storytelling often prefers one clean line where the past offers a maze. The deeper truth is that India's ancient power rarely rests in one capital for long. It moves. It gathers in Magadha when the eastern plains, iron, elephants, rivers, and new forms of taxation make a kingdom dangerous. It hardens under the Nandas, whose wealth seems to have frightened their enemies more than it preserved their reputation. It speaks in stone under Ashoka, then fragments into regional forces that do not return to silence. It travels through the Deccan with merchants and monks, through the northwest with coins carrying many gods, through Kushan crossroads where Buddhism moves towards Central Asia and China, through Gupta courts where Sanskrit praise and intellectual brilliance mask political looseness, through southern ports where pearls and pepper tie Tamil rulers to distant seas, through temples where Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, Pallas, Pallavas, and Cholas turned sacred architecture into royal memory. No single explanation fully accounts for this long pattern, because India's empires are not one phenomenon repeated under different names. There are many answers to the same question: how does power hold together a landscape too diverse to be easily ruled? Some answers are military: elephants, cavalry, forts, and disciplined infantry matter. Some answers are economic: grain feeds armies, ports enrich courts, guilds move credit, and land grants bind local elites to royal authority. Some answers are religious: a king who supports a monastery, temple, stupa, or sacred teacher gains legitimacy that no battlefield alone can provide. Some answers are administrative: inscriptions, measurements, offices, tax rights. And legal privileges turn authority into routine. And some answers are symbolic: a polished pillar, a gold coin, a mountain carved into a temple, a bronze god carried through the streets, or a royal title claiming the Ganges can persuade people that a dynasty belongs to a cosmic order larger than ordinary politics. Yet every answer contains weakness. Armies are expensive. Ports depend on winds and trade partners. Temples can gather wealth beyond the ruler's direct control. Land grants can decentralize revenue. Religious patronage can legitimize kings, but it can also strengthen institutions that survive without them. Roads help emperors move troops, but they also help rebels, merchants, monks, and rival kings move through the same space. The very networks that create empire can outlive and outgrow imperial command. This is why collapse in India often looks less like destruction than transformation. The centre fades, but the roots remain. The dynasty dies, but the temple keeps its fields. The conqueror vanishes, but the script he used continues in another court. The capital declines, but the river still carries boats. What survives in the record suggests that ancient India's hidden power is cumulative. Each empire leaves tools for the next. Magadha proves that the eastern plains can sustain large territorial rule. The Nandas show the force of revenue and military scale. The Mauryas show the reach of imperial administration and public inscription. The post-Mauryan kingdoms show that frontiers can produce cultural fusion rather than simple division. The Kushans show that India is part of Eurasia's wider circulation of goods and ideas. The Guptas refine languages of courtly power, science, and sacred kingship. The southern kingdoms show that ocean routes can be as important as land routes. The temple dynasties show that stone can hold political memory for 1,000 years. The Cholas show that ritual, bureaucracy, and maritime force can become one machine. The mystery is not that these empires vanished. All empires vanish eventually, whether through conquest, exhaustion, succession, climate stress, trade shifts, local resistance, or the slow erosion of obedience. The mystery is how much of them did not vanish. A traveller in India today can still stand before Ashokan pillars, Gupta-era images, Pallava carvings, Chalukya temples, Rashtrakuta caves, Pala bronzes, and Chola inscriptions. But even these visible remains are only the upper layer. Beneath them are older patterns: reverence for sacred rivers, the prestige of pilgrimage, the authority of written grants, the memory of local assemblies, the importance of monsoon trade, the political force of temples, the endurance of scripts and languages, the habit of absorbing outsiders and making them part of the landscape. Scholars still debate many details: the exact reach of certain dynasties, the dating of rulers, the meaning of inscriptions, the economic weight of trade, the social effects of land grants, the relationship between religious patronage and genuine belief. The evidence remains incomplete, and it will remain incomplete. Ancient India does not offer a single buried archive waiting to explain everything. It offers fragments scattered across a vast geography. But those fragments are enough to reveal a civilization whose empires were often more connected, more adaptive, and more powerful than simple memory allows. By the end of this long story, the forgotten empires no longer seem forgotten because they failed to matter. They seem forgotten because they mattered in ways that became part of the ground. Their power sank into roads, ports, scripts, temple walls, irrigation tanks, ritual calendars, trade habits, sacred images, and political ideas that later generations inherited without always naming the source. India's ancient rulers wanted permanence, as all rulers do. Most did not receive it in the way they imagined. Their names faded, their borders dissolved, their courts fell silent. But the hidden power they built continued to move, like water under stone, shaping the land long after the crowns were gone. And so the story slows, not at a final ruin, but in a landscape still carrying too many memories to count. The rivers keep moving past old capitals. The monsoon still darkens the sky over fields where earlier kings once counted grain as power. Roads have shifted, ports have silted, forests have retreated or returned, and cities have risen over older cities until the ground itself has become an archive too deep for any one lifetime to read. Somewhere beneath a modern road may lie the dust of a trade route. Somewhere inside a living temple may remain the rhythm of an ancient endowment. Somewhere in a script, a ritual, a village boundary, or a carved stone reused in a later wall. An empire continues without announcing itself. That is the quiet lesson of ancient India's hidden powers. Civilizations do not survive only through monuments. They survive through habits, through remembered landscapes, through the way people organize water, worship, trade, learning, and authority. A dynasty may believe it is the center of the world, but time has little interest in royal certainty. Time breaks titles into fragments. It turns palaces into mounds, victory into weathered stone, and armies into names that specialists argue over centuries later. Yet time also preserves unexpected things. A pillar can stand unread for generations and still wait for its voice to return. A bronze image can lose the procession it once knew and still hold the grace of movement. A temple inscription can list gifts of lamps and fields so precisely that, after 1,000 years, one can almost see the oil being poured and the flame being lit. The forgotten empires of India are not gone in the simple way. They have become difficult to separate from everything that followed. Their boundaries vanished, but their methods endured. Their rulers died, but their sacred geographies remained. Their wars ended, but their roads kept carrying pilgrims, merchants, and stories. In the end, perhaps this is the deepest kind of power not to remain unchanged, but to be absorbed so completely into the future that people walk through your legacy without noticing the shadow beneath their feet. The last image is not a battlefield or a throne room. It is evening over an old river, the air cooling after heat, the sound of water moving past stone steps worn smooth by generations. Above the bank, a temple bell sounds once, then fades. The river continues into darkness, carrying silt, memory, and the remains of kingdoms toward a sea that has heard all empires fall silent.